Allow me to ask a question. Why strive to make a strong or unique character in an ARPG? Really? Is it simply because it's fun to do so? Well, if that were the case, people would be making new characters all the time, regardless of the league cycle. I think the reasons at hand here go just a little bit deeper, and it's the fundamental through line of this entire video, tearing down and rebuilding some of the game design decisions that remove the player incentives to play more or to make new characters. Here are the 3 things Path of Exile 2 needs to do to reach the next level. The first thing they need to do is to open up skill combinations. The quote-unquote vision of Path of Exile 2 calls for players to combo multiple skills together depending on the circumstances, but there's a few big problems with this. Mainly there's just nowhere near enough skill interactability. At the moment, it feels like many skill combos have been put in these specific packages and closed off from the rest of the game entirely. The changes they made to Lightning Rod and Lightning Arrow in Point 2 is a fantastic example of this. I'm sure there are so many others in the game, of just the game moving towards this predefined combo state by the developers. There's a few things they can do here to fix this. First, a non-negotiable is to simply just add more raw interactability between skills. For example, why can't Whirling Slash have some sort of synergy with the wind-based spear skill Twister? Maybe if you do a Whirling Slash into one of the Twisters, it adds to your Whirling Slash and you become a sort of moving tornado. I'm not a game designer, but I'm sure there's a bunch of different cool ideas they can come up with here. They've come up with so many cool stuff in the past. Even if it might be a bit of animation and design intensive process. After they do this though, we have another problem with skill combos, and that's the weapon locking system. The system, I think, is in a bit of a fundamental conflict with the vision of combos, and it seriously needs to be addressed, even if it's in a minor way or it's in the long term a major way. I'm not calling for the removal of weapon locking altogether. It's a fine system, it makes complete sense. But there's a few options of things they can do to make it much better. First, they can just open up weapon locking to allow for certain abilities to be used across many weapon types. Falling Thunder, for example, maybe that can be used on Warhammers. They're both slams, and it would open up the game tremendously. It would allow for such different builds that we couldn't even imagine right now. They could do that for so many different, maybe make certain skills work on 2 or 3 while keeping others locked to 1. It would add so much dynamicism in that regard. The next thing has to do with the weapon swap. The original vision for a solution to this problem was for weapon swap to be this thing you used very often. But the issue here is you can only have 2 weapons, and the attribute requirements in this game are frankly out of control. The skill attribute and weapon attribute requirements are far too high to usually justify the opportunity cost when you can just use 1 skill. Fixing this would sort of be just a 0.5 solution and wouldn't fundamentally fix the problem. But they could improve it further by, I guess, adding a 3rd weapon set, but we're probably getting a bit too complicated at that point. In the end, I really hope they do move to open up skill combinations so players can actually flex some real creativity. There aren't enough tools in the toolbox, and that is from a design perspective, not just a content one. Sure, they can brute force it by adding 40, 50, 60 of each different weapon skills, but even then you're still having the same problem of these predefined packages. We need raw tools without developer guidance. That's the DNA of PoE. Obviously it's important to still have these plug and play packages, but everything in the game is a little bit much. The second thing that needs to change is we need more alternative ways to scale our character's effectiveness other than just damage. For this point, I'll use Path of Exile 1 as a comparison. In PoE 1 you have the following scaling vectors, non-comprehensive. Damage, defense, movement speed, attack and cast speed, which often affects your movement, and rarity. And then not to mention the numerous other vectors of scaling your character through unique items, for example. All of these have an absurd number of ways to scale them, and I've left out many more obscure ones as well. In PoE 2, you really only have 2 vectors, damage and rarity. Because you can't reliably scale vectors such as movement speed, people tend to gravitate also towards builds that have a higher inherent movement speed, ones that don't use armor, for example, ones that use The row amount, as you can see, very many builds like Lightning Spear that are on the Ranger and Hunter side of the tree that can use the row amount and take the few movement speed nodes are the most popular, because that's the big bottleneck of the game, because you can scale your damage to infinity and you can scale your rarity up to the cap, but what else can you do after that? Nothing much really, right? And you can do that way too easily. The passive tree of this game just needs a really big redesign to allow us to scale power in ways other than damage and rarity. Right now, the game becomes so flat once you enter the end game, because the only really change in your gameplay comes from a sort of Diablo-style number go higher. The great thing about PoE has always been the real changes in your gameplay that result from upgrades. Even just being able to scale speed and having to scale defense, for example, adds a completely different lens to character building that goes way further than people would think. Many alternate character scaling things are not just first order. They ripple throughout the entire design of the game in ways none of us can fully comprehend right now. I'm not asking for PoE 1 to PoE 2 to turn into PoE 1 in terms of how the game plays. I'm just asking for genuine character progression that incentivizes players to make decisions and to play past the early endgame to see how their character can evolve meaningfully. At the end of the day, making decisions and decision points are the fun parts of PoE 2. Obviously, we want to keep it new player friendly, but we don't want to make a worse game to do that. My final point is on the endgame. Nothing else of what I've talked about matters if the endgame stays in the same state that it's in right now. By far, the most important change that needs to be made is this. Difficulty and reward must be coupled in Path of Exile 2's endgame. The most egregious example of this not being the case is the map items themselves, or waystones I guess you would call them. Having prefixes and suffixes be positive/negative mods in a separate fashion is a massive mistake. Players need a reason to make a strong character. They need a challenge to overcome, otherwise they'll just stop playing. Why continue? That's one of the reasons why retention has been so bad in point 2. Staying on these reasons to make a good character, endgame needs more player choice and agency all around. I won't talk about crafting or itemization in this video, as that's kind of outside the scope, but I will talk about is how the agency and how the Atlas is structured. Right now, there is no choice. It is optimal to farm every mechanic all at once. There's no reason not to. Why would you not, right? You can spec into all the trees at the same time. There's no opportunity cost to doing so. This is terrible in so many ways that I'll go through. First, it funnels players into the best meta builds. Not Atlas strategies, but builds. Because being able to do all the different mechanics at the same time fundamentally means you need to play a build that can do all the mechanics at a high level. So you end up with these all-rounder builds that can just do all the mechanics, and they're just purely based around speed clearing, right? This removal of specialization drastically decreases build diversity. I would say that 1/3 of the entire reason to make a new character is to specialize into some certain mechanic, right? This asymmetry lets more niche builds still compete in the marketplace. While everyone is doing everything, inflation is an even phenomenon throughout the entire marketplace. When inflation happens, it happens to everything. You lose the ability to fulfill a niche and to make profit off of things that aren't being done as much, that maybe you really enjoy. Let's say in PoE 1, maybe your build is not the best for the optimal tier 17 juicing strategy, but maybe it's really good for Ultimatum. And in that case, you can farm Ultimatum, scale your build even higher, maybe do some other mechanics as well that are great for your build, and there you go. You're fulfilling a role in the market, you're having a good time, you're doing a niche, you're having a unique method of gameplay that you didn't have last league. It gives you a positive experience overall, right? Right now there's just way too many negatives instead of positives in the Atlas system of being able to do whatever mechanics you like that it just exists on your maps. Also, in my opinion, especially as new mechanics get added, you'll end up continuing to flood new players with way too much by incentivizing doing all the mechanics instead of specializing. I just don't think it's sustainable. Other than that, we need more ways to scale difficulty in the endgame, but that's already a given. I think everybody knows that. and it plays into my second point as well. If damage and rarity are going to be the main two scaling vectors, because you can't scale defense on the passive tree, for example, very well, then the game needs to be able to be made actually multiple times harder than it is right now, at the top end rather, so you have incentives to make these strong characters. Otherwise you just have so much excess power, you're just one-shotting tier 4 Zesh, as every build does right now. Alright, well, that's everything, folks. I hope you enjoyed, and I'm super excited for the reveal in 2 days now. You know, this is a pretty critical video, but that's kind of the point, right? We want the game to become better, and I have been kind of interested and excited about Path of Exile 2 for a long time now, right? So I would like the game to become better, and it has such a good, strong baseline in terms of graphics, combat, and like animations, for example, and music, that it really is just a matter of finding out those little details in game design that need just more modification. So that's everything. Have a good one.